Welcome to the 15th session of Within the Shadow of the Galilean, Teaching at the Temple, Part 1. During this session, we will look at the teachings that are found in Mark chapter 12 and the corresponding teachings found in Matthew and Luke. One of Mark's favorite writing techniques is to use what I like to call sandwiches. I would like you to notice how the structure of chapter 11 works. It begins with Jesus entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, ends with the question of Jesus' authority. The second section is a portion about a fig tree, and then another portion about a fig tree, and the central portion is Jesus in the temple. Mark writes this way so he can highlight what is most significant, Jesus in the temple. Chapter 12 has a similar structure, moving from the outside towards the center. It begins with the parable of the wicked husbandman and ends with the parable of the faithful widow. The next two matching sections are on paying tribute to Caesar and woe to the Pharisees. Then we have two questions, the question about resurrection and the question about David's son. Then finally we have the central issue, the Great Commandment. So here's a quick look at the structure of Mark 12. There's a parable of the wicked, opponents confronting Jesus twice, the Great Commandment, Jesus confronting the opponents twice, and then it closes with a parable of the faithful. Let's see how this compares to the structure of Luke and Matthew as Jesus teaches at the temple. So this is what happened when you set Jesus' teaching at the temple in Luke besides Jesus' teaching in the temple in Mark. It is the same structure except for the author of Luke places the great command at a different location than we find in the Gospel of Mark. The author of the Gospel of Mark adds two parables toward the beginning of Jesus' teaching in the temple and adds a lament toward the end of Jesus' teaching at the temple. Of the three unique things that Matthew adds to Jesus' teaching at the temple, Luke has two of those three, but they appear in other parts of Luke's gospel, which means they probably come from that same source that was collected of Jesus' teachings. This will be a good place to do our first summary. Mark provides the structure of Jesus' teachings at the temple and the order. It is not like Jesus came to the temple and said, you disciple, I want you to write down the things that I'm teaching. These developed over decades and finally came into the Gospel of Mark, which Luke and Matthew added to, and as we will discover, edited. Jesus' teaching continues in Mark 13, which is known as Jesus' apocalyptic discourse, his teaching about the end of the world. But it's really not about the end of the world. And we are going to take some significant time and deal with that in the next session. So that's all I have to say about that. Once Jesus gets done with his apocalyptic teaching in Mark and Luke, Jesus is done teaching in both Gospels. And the time of Jesus' passion begins. But that's not so with Matthew. Matthew gives us 4 more parables. All of these parables are meant to temper down Jesus' teaching of apocalypse, and 3 of them are unique to the Gospel of Matthew. parable of a good and wicked servant, a parable of 10 virgins, and a parable of the Last Judgment. One Matthew has in common, maybe, with Luke, the parable of talents, or as it's found in the Gospel of Luke, the parable of pounds. Of Jesus' teachings that we find in the Gospel of Mark, let's turn to what may go back to the lifetime of Jesus. There's a possibility that first parable, the parable of the wicked, may go back to the life of Jesus. We talked about that in session 7 when we talked about parables. It is possible that the first conflict between Jesus' opponents and Jesus may go back to the life of Jesus. That is the question of paying taxes to Caesar. The question of resurrection, which is the second confrontation between Jesus and the opponents, probably does not go back to the life of Jesus. The Great Commandment not only goes back into the life of Jesus, but goes back to the very beginning of the Jewish faith, was central to all of Jewish faith during the time of Jesus, including his discipleship communities, and has always and continues to be central to the Jewish faith. But the question about Jesus confronting his opponents with the question of David's son probably does not go back to the life of Jesus. There may be something in Jesus confronting the scribes and the Pharisees that goes back to the life of Jesus, but probably not in the parable of the faithful widow. Then finally in chapter 13, Jesus leaves the temple and goes to the Mount of Olives, where he does his apocalyptic teaching. We'll deal with this in our next session. Let's look at the section where Jesus confronts the Jewish leaders. Each gospel has its own unique introduction. In Mark, the large crowd was listening to Jesus with delight. In Matthew, Jesus said to the crowd and to his disciples. And in Luke, within the hearing of all the people, Jesus teaches his disciples. Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree on two things. The scribes, but in Matthew it is the scribe and the Pharisees, like to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. Mark and Luke both have a short teaching about the scribes devouring widows' homes for the sake of appearance. They say long prayers. Probably Luke copied, word for word almost, what he found in the Gospel of Mark. But Matthew goes on with significant portions of more teachings in conflict with Jewish leaders, some of which Luke has in different portions of his gospel. These probably come from that saying source of Jesus' teachings. So both in Mark and the saying source, we have Jesus' teachings that engage in conflict with the religious leaders. Two sources, interesting possibilities that may go back to the life of Jesus. I want to spend some brief time on the great commandment that we find in Jesus' teaching at the temple, because it's central to Mark's teaching and probably central to Jesus founding, nurturing, and developing his discipleship communities. For Mark and Matthew, they both happen at the temple, but Luke uses it as the introduction to the story of the Good Samaritan. Mark has a longer version than Matthew does. And for him, the highlight of this teaching is this is much more important than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifice. This is a twist we find at the temple, where the offerings and sacrifices are taking place. Jesus' response, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." I hope what you're discovering is that as we search for the shadow of the Galilean, the stories we find in the Gospels cannot be taken at face value. Some of them offer glimpses to who Jesus is, what he said, and what he did, but they do not offer us a newspaper account of the life of Jesus. Finally, I want to take a closer look at a couple parables. The parable of the talents is found in the Gospel of Matthew and is a teaching of Jesus at the temple. But you find it at a different place, maybe a different parable, maybe the same parable in Luke called the parable of the pounds. If you haven't already, I want to invite you to grab the document that was attached in the email for this session, Questing for Jesus, Checking the Boxes, the Parable of Talents, and the Parable of the Pounds. This is an exercise of looking at modern biblical interpretation, asking the question, where does it come from? If we were to look at Jesus developing discipleship communities, we'd cross, we'd have it almost everywhere. If Jesus talking about the kingdom of God, there'd be checking the boxes everywhere. For these parables, or this parable told in different ways, it's found in the special material that's unique to Matthew and the special material that's unique to Mark. There may be what I like to call a floating parable that may have been shared by storytellers. And that parable may go back to something Jesus may have said, if we're lucky, during his lifetime. So hearing all those clarifications, this may be a good time for you to pause the video and read over the parable as is found in Matthew and as is found in Luke. So as you read the two parables, you probably noticed they are different parables, but you hear echoes like, there's something similar here. So let's pause and look at what would be the next step. One of the things you notice is there are different introductions. For Matthew, Jesus is in Jerusalem. For Luke, he told the story because he was getting close to Jerusalem. There's also different endings. One of the things we want to do if we want to find a parable that goes back to the lifetime of Jesus, we're going to get rid of those two things, because the introduction and conclusion were probably written by the authors of Matthew and Luke. Now that we've gotten rid of the introductions and conclusions, we can look at the parable itself, and we are going to discover some very interesting structural similarities. While it takes 2 pages to spread the parables out so you can see the structure more effectively, you'll notice that within the parable there is an introduction and a conclusion and a body. So even though they're different, if you put them side by side, you notice there are similarities. The most distinct thing that's not there is in Matthew, the body of the parable has 2 parts, but in Luke, there's only 1 part to the body of the parable. So in both parables, even though the one who goes on a journey, in one is a nobleman, another one's a man, the servants are differently numbered. what happens in the body is very similar, although different. And the conclusions are different. So there are some scholars who think we can reconstruct a parable that might have, if we're lucky, gone back to the life of Jesus. That parable, if it is one of the Gospels, it's closer to the Gospel of Matthew than it is for Luke. Luke clearly has taken this basic structure and kind of developed his own thing, where Matthew may have kept closer to the original story, but transformed it and changed it in his gospel. So within the lifetime of Jesus, what could this parable have meant? First of all, the main character, the man who goes off on a journey, is not God. He's a wealthy, absentee landowner who is traveling throughout the Roman Empire, who gives years' worth of wealth to his most prominent servants, and they make significant profit off of the people who work the land or from people they purchase land from. So the third servant is right. The master is a harsh man, reaping where he does not sow and probably ought not to sow, and gathering where he did not scatter seed and probably shouldn't have. He has a reason to be afraid, just like all villagers have a reason to be afraid of a landowner like this. And the third slave does what a villager does. He buries the wealth. This is the type of parable villagers in Galilee would understand. They know about absentee landowners who come in and purchase their land and send them further into poverty. They also know you can't say anything like the third servant said without significant consequences. So they have different subversive ways to deal with absentee landowners. There are some scholars that think a parable like this could have gone back to Jesus. There are others who really doubt it. But the structure and what the content is possible. It's possible if there was a story like this during Jesus' lifetime. If there were people, storytellers going around loosely telling this parable but keeping the same format, and if Matthew and Luke were inheritors of those storytellers. There are also scholars who think that's highly doubtful. What we do know is that Matthew and Luke took this parable and placed it in Jesus' ministry at the temple, or right before Jesus gets to Jerusalem. And that's significant. It is significant for Luke because it sets the stage for the whole of Jesus' Jerusalem ministry. It is significant for Matthew because it helps him and his community clarify Jesus' apocalyptic teachings, which is our discussion for our next session.